Thank you, Brita. That was quite an introduction, and I don't know what to say to that, but to thank you. I mean, it's quite wonderful that you are organizing this webinar on this particular topic, and I would like to thank your college. I'd like to thank Principal Ghosh and, of course, my friends in your department and you for thinking of me. If you remember when you first told me that you would like me to speak here, I was a little taken aback because I have my thoughts on this particular issue, but I couldn't collect them as such because it was we are all going through this very quite chaotic situation. But thank you for asking me to speak here because I could collect some thoughts, and that is what I am going to present to you today. A rather random collection of thoughts which are neither very theoretical nor are very insightful, I am afraid. But I am speaking about these things because they have made me think, and they have made me, in a way, understand or try to understand what we are going through at this moment. Now, when I gave you a title, the title was the Oriental Apocalypse, Redefining Dystopia. The title sounds grand, but it's not that grand a presentation as such. These two ideas, apocalypse and dystopia, these are essentially narrative ideas. They have been included in various kinds of narratives in human history. And that is where I kind of started thinking that these narrative tropes are necessary because they are, in a way, imaginings. They are not truths. We have not really have had an apocalypse as such, or I don't know how to say this. Dystopia is something that we imagine. Utopia is more distant, but dystopia seems to be closer at hand. But the point is, these two concepts, they have been there, and they have been used by the powers that be, the structures that function. So, and you know, this made me also realize that we are all bound by this kind of narrative. Our lives, our societies, our cultures, they can be understood in terms of narrative theory as narratives themselves. So, and the thing is, what we talk about now, we have been talking about the normal, we have been talking about the new normal. And in a way, this COVID-19 outbreak is probably the biggest challenge to narrative that we have seen in our existence, in our lifetimes. To this day, in my life and in many lives, and as people have been saying, that this kind of challenge to a standardized narrative. We have been living a set life. That life might be good, that life might be bad, that life might have a lot of exploitation, it might have a lot of power, but the pattern was set. And here comes this COVID thing, which comes and violates everything. It destroys everything. We are struggling because our daily essential narratives apparently are no longer functioning. So we are trying to create new narratives. We are trying to look forward to the kind of narratives that we might create. So that is the idea that I am going with. And of course, there is this other idea that this apocalypse, dystopia, disease, all these things, when they come, not when they come, because apocalypse hopefully will never come, what happens is the grand narratives that function, they appropriate these challenges and they make these challenges work for them. Because you see, narrative is class specific. And even when you think about our current pandemic, you'd see different classes are responding differently. To someone who is living comfortably with no worry of money, this is a different kind of crisis. But for someone who is fighting for daily survival, this crisis again is very, very different, perhaps quite unimaginable for the other classes. And so this apocalypse paradigm, this is what I was thinking about, the apocalypse paradigm, the dystopia paradigm. And this also made me think of another difference, because when we talk about narratives, there are multiple narratives functioning in this world, because there are multiple worlds. And the two primary narratives that bother us, that function within us, are the Western narrative and the Oriental, so-called Oriental narrative, the East and the West. And these two narratives have always been different and perhaps even opposing or opposite. So these narratives, and when I say narratives, obviously I mean culture, I mean politics, I mean economics, and all these ideas are common in these narratives. So the Western narrative and the Eastern narrative, or if you do not, if you are uncomfortable with the term Oriental, I use it only because it kind of sounded nice, Oriental apocalypse. So now these two narratives, the Eastern and the Western, they have always historically conflicted. They have been counterpoints in a way. And we kind of tend to think that we have achieved a syncretic culture, a happy amalgamation of both East and West. But if you really think about it, I don't know, at the risk of sounding a little political in a very different way, how much of the East survive in this new culture, because it's basically the onslaught of the West. The Western narrative is historically, this is a historical truth, that we have been very, very influenced, very, very deeply influenced by the Western narrative. And this idea of globalization that we have been hearing for a very long time, now globalization, and we have a new term called globalization. But this globalization thing, it's essentially the West coming to the East. How much of the East is going to the West? I'm not talking about the religious or pseudo-religious ideas that the West seems to love, but what I'm talking about is this transfer of cultures, this amalgamation of cultures, and in that it has been the West which has essentially won. And I know that this is very contentious, and there are several points, debates which should arise out of these ideas, and the Western narrative has dominated the culture of the East, and what the East has done is to supply human resources to the West. I'm sorry, that's true, you know. But coming back to the point, even when we are talking about this particular pandemic, if you think about it, this pandemic became a pandemic only when it reached Europe. When it began in China, we were not really worried it was a Chinese problem, and we are interested in what our neighbors do, but quite often we end up not caring about them in any depth as such. So this thing, but when Europe started to suffer, then this became a global phenomenon. So we still, I'm not saying this is not a global phenomenon, this is, but the awareness of its global dimension became apparent only when we had this Eurocentric kind of phenomenon. Before that it was Asian, before that it was, although a huge number of people were affected over a huge area or population, but we did not really care about it. But this is where I am coming back to the idea of apocalypse, because Europe apocalypse is again a very Western idea. It's a biblical idea. It's a almost, it's basically religious. That's what I'm trying to say. So the end of humanity is what the apocalypse usually tries to point at, the idea, the concept of apocalypse. But the other definition of apocalypse, if you look at any dictionary, I guess, is civilization on the brink of destruction. That is the other meaning. And if you look at what this pandemic is doing, it's not threatening the survival of humanity as such. The mortality rates, etc. It's not that terrifying from that point of view, but it is terrifying because of the paradigm shift that it is indicating. Because, as I mentioned, from the old normal to the new normal, the end of the old normal, so that is the end of values, that is the end of one paradigm which civilization, as we call it, had effectively established. And already the states are, the politics, the power, everything, they are focusing on this phenomenon, and they are, as I said, appropriating it, utilizing it, benefiting from it. But let me not become too political or too theoretical here. So apocalypse, as I said, is this end of a paradigm. But the thing is, when we come to India, and this has been a complaint that a lot of people have been making, that we Indians are not really taking this pandemic seriously. At this point of time, we are looking at numbers which are alarmingly increasing. So there is this idea that it's the fault of the people, and because they are not obeying rules, they are not wearing masks and all that stuff, that this pandemic is becoming what it is. And this is the ultimate point that I am coming to. In a while, I will be coming to this point, that why is this so? I mean, I am looking around, everybody is looking around, and we see that truly there are people who are not paying as much attention to this issue as they probably should. There are several reasons for it. There are people who simply cannot afford to. It's a matter of survival. There are people who choose not to. There are people who are very brave. They are very adventurous. This pandemic becomes an extreme sport to them. But somewhere deep down, there is a resistance. And why do we have this resistance, even when the consequences can be of apocalyptic proportions? And apocalypse, the kind of apocalypse that we have read about in literature or in theoretical books or in religious books, have ended up either in complete destruction, or they have created dystopia. widespread destruction resulting into utopia is not something that we usually see in these literatures of apocalypse. And I will be talking about the literature of the apocalypse for a very, very brief period of time. Now, this made me think that, see, apocalypse is a kind of end of days. It signifies a finality. And when we talk about India, when we talk about Hinduism in particular, this final ending is not something that is there in this kind of culture. That there is no final death. What we have is a cycle of ages. We know that we have the 4 ages, Shatya Yug, Dwapar Yug, Treta Yug, and Kali Yug. Kali Yug in Hindi, as fashionably said. And there is this avatar Kalki who will come and who will destroy everything, but that destruction doesn't seem to be kind of final, because again it's a cyclical idea that we believe in. So in a way, as opposed to the Western narrative, the Indian Hindu narrative is speaking of a cycle of existence. So not the end of existence. And it doesn't really matter to which ethos or ethnicity or religion or culture that one may belong to. But when people coexist for a long time, they have a shared kind of belief. This is something that I believe in, however much this idea may be challenged. But there is a harmony, which sometimes there are conflicts, but generally history speaks of this harmony. And there is this whole Indian kind of an ethos which speaks of this harmonious existence, where people believe in this cycle of existence. People end up believing in this cycle of existence. And the apocalypse idea, which is essentially very pessimistic, is the other point, because these apocalypse ideas all say that humanity will go down to the dogs, it will be absolutely degenerate, and it will deserve the destruction it will find. Sometimes, I am someone who believes that drastic measures need to be taken because humanity is losing itself. But the thing is, what we talk about when we talk about this apocalypse, there is always this element of hope if you believe in a cyclical nature of existence. I do not mean that you have to be reincarnated, but it's a continuous kind of existence. I am not going to get religious or spiritual here, but this is what I kind of feel, and please think about it. And incidentally, when I was looking for these theories and looking for these ideas regarding the 4 yugas of Hinduism and etc., there is a surprising number of websites now which deal with these things. There are lots and lots of detail available. So if you really want to know about these things, you will have a gold mine of information on the net. But it's difficult to know which ones to follow and which ones not to follow, because some are politically motivated, some are theoretically motivated. If there is a motivation apart from the academic, then that's a problem. But anyway, see, when we talk about this apocalypse, then the parts, the issues that become significant in this apocalyptic idea, war definitely, epidemic or pandemic definitely, and also famine. And this famine bit is something that made me think again. Thanks to Pritha, I have had this delightful chance of thinking about something very seriously, even in these trying times. This idea of famine. And see, in Western narratives, in Western culture, Western literature, there is this entire branch which deals with apocalypse. We can kind of say that there is a genre of apocalyptic literature. So lots and lots of, and there are so many texts which have been dealing with epidemics and disease-related deaths. I mean, beginning from Decameron by Boccaccio and Utopia, Francis Bacon is writing, I think, the New Atlantis. Then you have, of course, the Plague by Albert Camus, and Saramago is writing. There are a host of science fiction literature that is speaking about the literature, that this idea of apocalypse. Even if you are a popular culture buff, then you would know about the Resident Evil series and the video games, the movies, the novels that came out of these, and they all talk about the end of humanity, a kind of dystopic future, the Mad Max paradigm, if one may call it. So there is this host. I mean, you just search the internet and you'll find so many texts dealing with such apocalyptic ideas. But when I was thinking of the Indian texts, there are not many that you can find. And of course, these Indian texts, they are not focusing on epidemics, which is surprising, because like all other parts of the globe, India also had its share of disease and death. And the kind of literature that we find here, war literature, not much, although there are some, but not a lot. And because, see, if I call this survival literature, not apocalyptic literature, rather survival literature, then it brings to the core that what is the meaning of survival. Survival is, there are two distinct narratives of survival. This is the point from which I started the two different narratives, the Western narrative and the Eastern narrative. Because when we talk about survival in the Indian context can have a very different meaning. Because if you look at the paradigms of widespread death, because many times there are propaganda issues, many times there are existential issues, but one of the plots that we have recorded in human history, one of the most hated, disgusting, I do not have enough adjectives for such a thing, enough qualifiers for such a thing. If you talk about the Holocaust, the designed program targeting one particular ethnicity and destroying them systematically, that Holocaust is also European. It's a part of the European narrative. I am not taking anything away from that. I am not saying that it was not absolutely horrible. I am not saying that it was not devastating. It was not inhuman to a remarkable degree. I'm not saying any of those things. But it is absolutely horrible. But if you think about parallel events, parallel numbers of death that had happened in India, not only in India, the reason this is Oriental, if you think about Vietnam, if you think about carpet bombing, if you think about Korea, if you think about the 2 atom bombs, and in a way, in the Orient, such widespread holocausts in Japan, in China, again and again in history, you will see there are, if you think about, I'm not going over to South America or North America, but such eradication of populations, or at least attempt at eradicating entire populations, have been there in this has been an European tendency for a long time, something that we seem to be inheriting. But the thing is, this Holocaust idea, if I use the term Holocaust, I should not, let's call it this mass destruction of human lives. This had been a regular thing in our colonial past. We have not really, we are very familiar with such things, because genocide is something that we have seen. And the Western records of history does not always show it, because if you think about it, after 1857, when the British retaliated, we hear about the atrocities done by the sepoys in the mutiny. We hear about the deaths of innocent women and children and men, which were truly tragic. Again, each and every such death is tragic, regardless of the color or ethnicity or power equation or whatever. They are tragic, but the retaliation was something which was incredible. They actually destroyed villages after villages. And this is something the Western paradigm of history refuses to record. And there are records, but anyway, my point is that we have been on the receiving end of genocide for such a long time that widespread death is not something that bothers us. I have been going back to Mary Shelley's The Last Man again and again. I have been a fan of survival literature for a long time. All these literatures that we read, J.G. Ballard's The Drowned World, or even the Mad Max paradigm, you will see food is not always the issue. The primary issue there, food or clothing, they are not really bothered about that. That is the Eurocentric, that is the Western narrative. What they're bothered about ultimately is power. How power equations happen. And the other thing is, from the Western point of view, from the Western narrative point of view, Eurocentrism works in such a way that they fail to realize what is happening in the far-flung colonies. They can otherize these colonies so easily that they fail to see the genocides that are happening over there. And that is changing to an extent. There are honorable exceptions where people are actually writing about a global perspective rather than an Eurocentric perspective. So, what I'm trying to say is that if you think about it, the average Indian will have this ethnic, cultural memory of widespread death. Our histories, our literatures, they will be based on the backdrop of such deaths. So such ideas will not become the central ideas, but the idea of survival will become more important than the pandemic itself, than the apocalyptic event that is happening. And let me just give you a few numbers, because when we talk about Bengali literature in particular, I am not, unfortunately, and very, I apologize for this, I am not that familiar with other Indian literatures as much as I should be. But as far as Bengali literature is concerned, I'll just give you some numbers and you think about it. There was this cholera epidemic, 1881 to 1896, for 15 years. This epidemic reigned. 170,000 people died in that epidemic. There was a Kumbh Mela at that time. No, sorry, this is a little later. Uh, I'm sorry, this 170,000 people died in the Kumbh Mela alone. And in the cholera epidemic that happened in between 1905 and 1923, more than 500,000 people died. Then more than 10 million people died in the third plague pandemic that happened in India. And there were smallpox epidemics which killed thousands in Kolkata around the end of the 19th century, not the last century, 1874-75, and again 1894 and 95. That is where you already again have that. Malaria was there, tuberculosis was there, widespread death, and in fact, these deaths, if you collect them, you'd see the number would become staggering. So many deaths in Bengal, in the vicinity of Kolkata. So mass death is something that we are historically, culturally familiar with. And even in 1974-75, there was a smallpox epidemic which killed a huge number of people. Now, let me come back to my point. With all these deaths, and this is the time when our luminaries are writing, we don't really have a lot of epidemic literature. These deaths, these diseases firmly stay in the background. I mean, we know that there is Oshoni Sanket, we know there is Akale Sandhane, there is in 1947, Bhavani Bhattacharya wrote so many hungers, but this is the point that I am coming to. The point is not disease, but hunger, famine. We know that there is this discussion how Churchill successfully created, or rather it was an artificial famine which happened because of British negligence, which killed an enormous number of people. So culturally, even when we speak about places like Navanno, and we have this idea of hunger which is ruling. So to our ethnic presence, to our ethnic existence in this part of the world, I mention ethnic because it's not merely religious, it's a cultural composite existence that I'm talking about. Hunger is more feared than death. And our collective memories focus on these hungers. And you see, death is natural. Hunger is not supposed to be natural. I mean, hunger is natural, but culturally, hunger is a different thing. And this is where famines become more important. And there is this joke that people are going to the bazaars buying food. They're not afraid of the disease, but they are much, much more concerned about food. There is this cultural kind of justification that I see, because we are more afraid of hunger than death. And it may be surprising, it may be it may not make sense to a generation which is very new, which does not really have those memories, but if that is quite something to think about. And when what we are not afraid of is dystopia, right? Because generally such apocalyptic things, if you go to the bazaars and if there is the epidemic spreads, the pandemic spreads, everybody dies, what will happen? Dystopia will happen, right? Existence of humanity is not challenged, as I said almost at the beginning, but a kind of dystopia is something that we are looking forward to. But the thing is, this is where this redefinition of dystopia comes into play, my title, that if you think about it, the Western narratives of dystopia, they give you some steps. And one of those steps is that people are made to surrender their basic rights at some point of time. And this is where the Western narrative and the Eastern narrative are very, very different, because this idea of basic human rights is very different here. And if you look at colonial literature, our literature, instead of celebrating epidemics, not celebrating, commemorating epidemics, or instead of talking about famine as such, they have spoke about colonial issues. Because post-colonial literature and colonial literature, they have been about another kind of survival. They have been about something entirely different, an existential crisis which the Eurocentric narrative does not understand. An existential crisis for which the Eurocentric narrative is entirely responsible. So that has happened, and power, and if you look at these Western narratives, the concern, as I said, is power. If you read The Drowned World, if you read Margaret Atwood's famous Year of the Flood, you'd see they are all talking about how to manage power, how to hold on to their survival with dignity, with rights, some kind of rights, but with some power, because human right is all about having power. And this is where the Indian identity is very different. This Indian history of literature has been post-colonial, colonial, and the identity formation, that things we know. And of course, the Indian issue has always been food-oriented. So food has been a major part of the Indian idea of existence. There are problems, but there are other issues as well. So when we look at this, and when we, let me kind of end, because I am reaching the point of end. I have been given a slot, and I believe in sticking to that slot. So the idea of apocalypse as a failure of the state mechanism, it can be imperial ambitions, it can be a violation of the rights of the citizens, it can be a number of things. Even epidemic can be looked at as a failure of the state mechanism. So civil war is also a part of that, famine, and these are things that we find in dystopia, where the state mechanism completely collapses and there are no structure present as such. But the thing is, when we talk about our part of the world, what we have is that this basic human idea of hunger, of human rights, they are number one class specific, they are caste specific, money oriented, definitely. And so when we talk about the responsibility of the individual citizen, the question is, if not all citizens of the country will have equal human rights, will have access to equal human privileges, can you really expect all of them to share the similar responsibility? If they do not have rights, then they do not have that sense of responsibility, because they are already living in dystopia. So what we do not have in our culture, in our history, is an idea of dystopia, because dystopia is something that we have been historically having for a long time. The entire colonial rule was dystopic for our people. So what we have come out of dystopia, we are trying to configure a new kind of a thing. So, and since we believe in a cyclical existence where death is not the final end, these issues of dystopia, human rights, power, the issues that also create utopia, both of them are missing. So food becomes very important, hunger becomes very important, and these ideas of apocalypse and dystopia, they are not really valid, or they are not really things that bother the Indian population as such. These are my thoughts. I am sure you would be disagreeing with me vehemently. I sincerely hope so, because without such exchange, without such disagreement, no idea can move forward. So thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to speak all this rubbish for the last 40 minutes, I think. Thank you.